Let's cross to Beirut and speak to Sarah El-Yafi, a public policy and specialist of international affairs. Sarah, glad to have you on the program and speaking to Paris Direct. First of all, please give us some insight as to what the current situation is like in Beirut.
Well, thanks for having me. It is one of a country being beaten, displaced, and honestly carved open from several directions at once. In the past week alone, Lebanon's death toll reached 394 killed, including 83 children. So Israel has expanded the scope of its strikes from the south and the Bekaa into the heart of Beirut. It actually bombed a building in Roshi, which is the heart of Beirut, the first strike inside Beirut city limits. Also killing children. The cruelty of that image really, really matters because Israel ordered residents across a very broad section of southern Lebanon to move north of the Litani in an evacuated zone, covering a very large portion of the Lebanese territory. And that is simultaneously happening while Israeli forces are moving at least inward. And the violence is not only aerial in eastern Lebanon. Just a couple of days ago, there's an Israeli airborne commando raid that occurred, leaving 41 people dead overnight. I mean, we have a genocidal entity next door that does not remotely operate in a universe where international law carries any meaningful force, restraint, or consequences on its actions. And just to remind everybody that during the ceasefire, for 15 months, Israel killed more than 400 people during the ceasefire. Lebanon, have applied every part of the ceasefire agreement, and they applied none of it. And still, they collect 100,000 soldiers at our border, and they did so before any alleged trigger. So we are really under a mad assault, and this absolutely needs to stop immediately.
Since Monday, it seems like every day brings with it a different escalation for Lebanon in terms of the scope and the scale of the attacks, as well as who's being impacted. But now that it's been a full week, can you walk us through how it began?
Well, I mean, it began first with an illegal war on Iran, a war not born of necessity and certainty, certainly not out of principle. It was launched by and for leaders accused of some of the gravest crimes under international law. That is the wider context. Lebanon, however, was pulled into the inferno through a related but very distinct sequence. Once again, for 15 months, Israel had already been violating the ceasefire in Lebanon. It had been laying the groundwork for a broader assault. So we must absolutely not be misled by the timing. Yes, people will tell you that Hezbollah fired rockets. And unfortunately, it did. And whatever narrow military or organizational rationale Hezbollah may have had, the political result for Lebanon is very clear. The country was once again made to absorb destruction through a unilateral decision taken without any clear national consensus at the cost of deepening a very dangerous internal fracture. So that's the central point, but a very important distinction must be made. We have to beware of the simplistic claim, which is repeated in much of the Western press and in some of the local media as well, that we were dragged into war by Hezbollah as though Lebanon had been living in peace and then Hezbollah suddenly disrupted it. To be clear, what Hezbollah did is absolutely wrong and very dangerous, but the framing is false and also dangerous because Israel's political and military leadership had been advancing plans for a much wider assault on Lebanon for months. In fact, by the admission of Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, the Israeli cabinet had approved a military operation against Lebanon on March 2nd before Hezbollah launched their first volley of rockets. And furthermore, one day before Hezbollah's rocket launch on May 1st, Israel had already mobilized 100,000 reservists, intensified its military deployment along the Lebanese and Syrian fronts in what was plainly the posture of a state preparing for a major military assault. And this came again after 15 months of ceasefire, during which Lebanon upheld its side of the agreement while Israel kept attacking Lebanon. It racked up more than 15,400 violations, William, and never withdrew from our territory, which is what the ceasefire agreement ordained them to do. So to be clear, by the time Hezbollah launched the rockets, Israel was not a restrained actor pushed reluctantly into war. It was already operating within the logic of escalation. Israel has repeatedly shown that it does not require a credible pretext, a legal basis, or a moral warrant to attack or bomb Lebanon. It will manufacture the pretext if it wants to. It will invent the justification it needs. It will sell the lie required to widen any war that it wants. And that has long been part of its modus operandi. And this is very important to remind everybody about this, because the Lebanese people in their entirety really deserve far better than to have their lives and their suffering and their future subordinated to decisions that are made above their heads. The Lebanese people really deserve far better than to be handed new reasons to fear one another, resent one another, and fracture, especially as Lebanon stares down the prospect of renewed occupation.
Yes, Sarah, you mentioned the daily violations of that ceasefire. How do you read those breaches?
I mean, today Lebanon stands at the edge of renewed occupation. Okay, the Israelis attacked Lebanon 15,400 times during the ceasefire. The Israelis flattened more homes, entire villages, and burned more olive groves during the ceasefire than during war. As per ACLED stands for Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. It's an American registered nonprofit conflict monitor. They recorded one Israeli attack every 4 hours, with only around 2 days per month seeing no Israeli attack at all during the ceasefire. Israel killed 400 people. They injured 1,000 people during the ceasefire. That is their modus operandi. They have to be called out. If you listen to the Israelis, they are telling you their plan. They reveal a political climate in which territorial ambition is voiced openly across Israel's governing and opposing spectrum. And it's echoed by its most powerful foreign patron, the United States. I have to remind everybody that in August 2025, in an interview with I-24, the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said he felt very attached to the vision of a greater Israel. He described himself as being a historic and spiritual mission. In February 2026, last month, Yair Lapid, he's so often presented abroad as the reasonable centrist alternative to Netanyahu. Well, he also said our mandate is over the land of Israel, of biblical Israel, that the biblical borders of Israel are the borderland of Israel, and they're clear. This is an expansionist thinking that runs well beyond the far right and reaches very deep into Israel's political mainstream. It is actually reinforced and echoed in Washington. You know, you have Mike Huckabee, who also said, you know, they can take it all if they wanted to. So, and we also have these settlers who are crossing into southern Lebanon, calling for Jewish settlement there. They auction plots of South Lebanon. And yes, we have, once again, as I said, Mike Huckabee, who's endorsing this maximalist, genocidal, expansionist fantasy as though it was an ordinary policy option. And this is in the midst of genocidal calls from Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister, threatening to reduce Beirut to the devastation of Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis, who is enduring a genocide. That's not language of temporary defense. This is a language of a political culture that normalizes expansion and depopulation and the remaking of borders by force and by genocide if required. And what makes it more dangerous is that the rhetoric is aligned with military practice. Today, they're calling for a buffer zone inside of Lebanon. The repeated incursions and the mass displacement order and the retention of all the Israeli positions in South Lebanon, that is not just because they want to have a little bit of security. It's a very familiar pattern. Israel speaks the language of security while preparing facts on the ground that can later be converted into enduring territorial realities. That is core Israeli strategy. Israel is notorious for violating ceasefire and armistice agreements, even when those agreements were drafted in terms that are favorable to them, only for them to use the ceasefire and the armistices to as opportunities for Israel to improve facts on the ground. That's how
Sarah,
they gain more territory.
sorry, running out
Yes.
of time. Just wanted to ask you. Yesterday, we had someone from Care France on the program who was talking about the humanitarian crisis in Lebanon. Given we have 500,000 people fleeing, she mentioned the government's efforts, but said, given its weak position, given the state of the economic crisis, it needed international help. Given everything you're discussing here, what would you like to see done from the international community?
I mean, the international community has failed on every standpoint of international law. The modern architecture of international law was overwhelmingly shaped by the Euro-Atlantic victors of the Second World War. Okay, that's largely the United States and Europe. But those same powers have shown a remarkable readiness to hollow out their own institutions when those institutions move toward holding Israel accountable. Israel is facing now a genocide case before the International Court of Justice, and its prime minister is wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity. These are Western institutions who have decided that. But instead of allowing those institutions to function, the United States sanctioned 4 ICC judges back in June 2025. And in July 2025, they also sanctioned Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, who had spent months documenting Gaza in legal terms and pressing for accountability. Even France, so fond of presenting itself as le pays des droits de l'homme, the country of human rights, said Benjamin Netanyahu enjoyed immunity from the ICC warrant, and they would continue working with him. Instead of being treated like the international fugitive that he is treated like a protected ally with French airspace effectively open to him. In Washington, they keep welcoming him to Congress with repeated standing ovations. Just imagine that. Representatives of the American people, acting in the name of the American people, rising again and again on their feet to applaud a man wanted for war crimes with more enthusiasm than they reserve for any American. What I'm saying is that the message from the leaders of the United States and Europe could not be clearer. International law is invoked against enemies of Israel, but it is suspended for Israel. The center of the world is Israel, and international law has been proclaimed dead by the very people who created institutions to uphold it. And I just want to say that the price tag of killing international law, the way that they have, will heavily backfire on their societies. These institutions are celebrated as guardians of universal law only for as long as they do not threaten Israeli impunity. The moment their self-appointed custodians begin gutting them from the inside.
Sarah,
And
we
what
are
dies
out
in
of
the
time. I'm
process.
sorry I have to cut you off, but we're out of time. We're coming up on the end of the program. But I want to thank you for joining us, Sarah
Thank you.
El-Yafi, joining us from
Appreciate it.
Beirut. Thank you.